Good morning again, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for that. Thank you for that short break, which was necessary to synchronise our times with Room 1. So I thank you for taking up that time. It now gives me great pleasure to introduce Mr. Matt Jolly. Matt is a research ecologist with the United States Forest Service, working out of the Rocky Mountain Research Station and the Missoula Fire Sciences Laboratory. And Matt, again on the theme of decision making in high risk, high consequence environments, is going to speak on real-time extreme fire behaviour risk assessment system to improve wildland firefighter situation awareness. Please welcome Matt Jolly.
Hola a todos. Lo siento que hablar en inglés y espero que perdónenme. My name is Matt Jolly. I'm a research ecologist with the U.S. Forest Service. My primary research interests are in linking fire weather with fire behavior. And today we're going to talk about the development of a system for United States firefighters to inform situational awareness to mitigate the risk of firefighter exposure to extreme fire behavior. The reason this is important is because the world is changing. Today is different than yesterday, and we cannot expect experience alone to inform all firefighter situational awareness, because our firefighters and firefighters around the world are actually experiencing situations that have never been observed before in history. And from that, this combination of unique events that combine to create fire behavior that we've never seen before is leading us to situations where we're exposing firefighters to a tremendous amount of risk in situations where they have very little chance of being successful. And our objective with this entire system is to recognize that we need a better tool or a better set of tools to describe fire behavior changes and to categorize how those fire behavior changes are a result of the fire weather that we can actually forecast and display across a landscape to inform tactical and strategic decisions. So our firefighters in the U.S. And obviously here too, as the previous talk alluded to, follow a set of standard firefighting orders. We call them the 10 and 18. Three of those are particularly important, and that is that we expect firefighters to keep informed of fire weather conditions and forecasts. Base all actions on current and expected fire behavior, and to fight fire aggressively, having provided for safety first. All of this is great in theory, but in practice we don't actually provide a lot of resources or tools to get that job to inform these standard firefighting orders. So our work is really meant to guide us towards a more objective system that allows us to make decisions at an individual incident level. So when we have a new start somewhere on the landscape and firefighters are responding, we want to give them the information that they can use to know what expected fire behavior could be for that day, because we know that those changing fire weather conditions are manifesting themselves in some really unfortunate events for us. And one of them is that if we look at just the top 10% of all days out of all of history, is this red bar right here. Inside that red bar is 5 lines. Those 5 lines are labeled as South Canyon, 30 Mile, Yarnell, Frog, and Twisp. Those are 5 firefighter fatality events that happened in the United States, where 14 people died in South Canyon, 4 people died in 30 Mile, 19 people died in Yarnell, 1 person died in the Frog Fire, and 3 people died in the Twisp Fire. They're all concentrated in this upper 5% or less of those days. And so we know that these critical fire weather days are very important to capture, but we're not giving firefighters the resources that they need to act on those changes. So that's the objective of what we're doing. So what we're trying to do is combine fire danger information with observations of our categorical fire behavior to provide an objective risk metric that allows us to improve situational awareness and to minimize firefighter risk exposure to extreme fire weather conditions. Basically, the intent of this system is to provide an objective metric that allows firefighters to be successful when they engage in a particular activity and to keep them away from particular fires that we know lead to fatalities. So we have two components that I'll talk about today. One is just is mapping the hazard itself, and we differentiate between hazard and risk, and that hazard is anything that can cause harm, but the risk is actually how likely that thing is to impact someone. So risk is basically a combination of the probability and the consequence, and we'll talk about two individual components of that today. So we have a system that we developed that actually combines fire danger information from our weather station network that we use for fire weather across the United States. We have about 2,200 weather stations that are distributed around the country, and that actually informs this the initialization of a point forecast, and from that we actually create a set of forecasted fire danger indices, which we're allowed to actually combine back together using a historical climatology to generate two maps. And these maps are produced every day and they're made available on a mobile device, but they represent the forecast of the fire environment for the next 7 days. And we can provide that in any number of ways to decision makers. But the real power of this is when we combine these two maps together into this severe fire weather potential index. We prototyped it 2 years ago. Last fire season, we rolled out an example of it, and had managers to start to use it and to start thinking about not just how pretty this map is, but how would you actually take a map and integrate it into fire operations? How do you actually take that and change what you do on the most extreme days so that we can minimize the number of firefighters' fatalities that we have on those extreme days, and so that when we are engaging in activities, we can be successful with those activities. And just an example of what it looks like, these are screen grabs from the mobile app, but this is what the western U.S. looked like in last summer. There was a new start in Southern California that these are actually the satellite fire detects of when the fire actually started, right in this extreme fire weather condition gap. When that fire started, they issued pre-evacuation notices for almost 90,000 people. So it was a very high-profile event, but this system allows you to have this information before you respond to a new start, such that you can actually know that this fire is starting under these extreme conditions. That fire was called the Blue Cut Fire. But really, the hazard itself doesn't tell us as much as when we try to link it back to what fire behavior is actually doing. So what we did is we did a study for 3 of our national forests in the Northwest. So this is Montana, where I live, Idaho, and we have 3 national forests, the Lolo, the Salmon Chalice, and the Bitterroot National Forests, that we're able to actually get observed fire behavior data from several hundred fire days across the area. It allows us to actually take our fire danger indices and to take categorical observations of the kind of fire we saw on that day. So was the fire smoldering? Did we see torching trees? Did we see a crown fire? Did we see fires that people called extreme or erratic? And it allows us to bring all that information together into a way to predict the likelihood of any one of those kind of fires happening on a given day. So that we construct these probabilities, and then we weight each one of those types of fire behavior on their potential impact to firefighter safety. We know that extreme fire behavior is very erratic and hard to plan for, so it poses the largest risk to firefighters. And what we saw is that from our simple indices, the energy release component just tells us how hot and dry it is, and the burning index, which is the other axis over here, just tells us how windy it is. But lo and behold, we find that the most extreme fire behavior happens when it's hot, dry, and windy. Big surprise, maybe not so much. But now we can actually quantify it. So from that, we can use that information to start examining when things happen. So we create this fire behavior risk index. And the risk index is just created by calculating the probabilities of any one of these 5 types of fire behavior on a given day. We weight it by the consequences or the impacts to firefighter safety, and then we have an index that we can map back across the landscape that we can also forecast forward and provide it in a mobile device to firefighters so they have that information forecast out for the next 7 days. Here's why it's important. We went back and looked at a fire in 2015, the Twist Fire, where 3 firefighters died, and this black line is the actual fire perimeter for that fire. And the dark red is the area of the highest or most extreme fire weather potential. And when we combine it with fire behavior, we see that those people were operating in fire weather conditions that were the most extreme that have ever been observed. So the top 1% of the days of all of history was where they were actually operating. So we know that with this kind of information, we can start to minimize when we expose firefighters to situations where they can't be successful. So lots of lines here, but the interesting part about this is that we can tell you how likely it is to have a different kind of fire on a different day. So as it gets drier along this axis, we find that creeping fires or low intensity fires happen when it's not very dry, and as it gets drier, the likelihood of a crown fire or extreme fire behavior increases. But we can look at it as a 2-factor plot. This is just basically an extension of the one that I just showed you, but it shows that the likelihood of these fires for smoldering fires is very low under low fire danger conditions. And as the fire danger becomes more extreme, the likelihood increases to have higher intensity fires or different kinds of fires that pose a different risk to firefighter safety. We can combine all that into essentially this normalized fire behavior risk, which is a combination of all of the probabilities weighted by their consequence or their impact to firefighter safety. One of the interesting things is that we can also see fire behavior from space. This is the fire radiative power that we see from MODIS as plotted against the different kind of fire behavior that was observed on those days. So our extreme or erratic fire behavior is where we see the highest spread in intensity from the satellite observations. And we see the same thing relating the fire behavior risk metric to the MODIS FRP. So very encouraging that the metric itself tells us something. The great thing is that we can take our fire danger forecast, we can translate that forecast into probabilities of observing a smoldering fire or observing torching on a given day or crown fires or extreme or erratic fire behavior. And then we can map it back to the forest at the individual forest level so that you can respond to a particular place. So these are 2 examples of an early season where the risk is very low, and then during the peak of the fire season where the risk is high. But even then we see gradients where the risk was extremely low in the southeast of the San Michelis during this time period. And that was a very real observation as well. Ultimately, though, what we have to do is we have to change the way we think, as was brought up in the early discussion today during the plenary. But that means that we have to take all of this information up to this fire behavior risk, and then we have to figure out how do we take a map and change what we do. And that's the real challenge, is that we know we can show everyone that our firefighters are dying under the most extreme fire weather conditions. But how do we change what we do under the most extreme set of conditions such that we start reducing the number of fatalities that we have under those periods. So essentially, we have to get to a point to where operationally we're constrained under extreme fire weather conditions, because we're recognizing that that's a high probability, high consequence event. And ultimately, we know that this system is the first of its kind to link these things together. But the cool thing is it's surprisingly simple to collect the information you need to run it anywhere else. The data are easy to collect. We have some future enhancements planned where we integrate the fuels, the fuel loading, fuel type back into the system. But it has the potential to help us assess fire weather conditions as a real risk factor and apply that information operationally so that we can make different decisions. And from that, I'll take any questions.
So are there any questions for Matt on his presentation? Which, yes, and we'll ask you to speak into the microphone so it can be interpreted.
This may be an unfair question. A lot of people use the Canadian Fire Weather Index system.
Yep.
And it includes representations of fire behaviour for different FWI values. And it also uses the other codes, the other code indexes, to try and create impressions of likely fire behaviour under different ranges of conditions. Have you compared your work to the Canadian system?
I haven't, but I consider what this is actually more complementary to what they're doing already, in that rather than predicting a discrete kind of fire behavior for a given day, which is what the Canadian system does, this one assumes that we're not going to know exactly what the outcome of that is for a given day. So basically, assumes uncertainty and provides a way to include the uncertainty into a metric. But I suspect that we will do that in the future because it is sort of a segue to what we're doing here. So short answer is no, I guess.
Thank you. Are there any more questions for that? And I think just making an observation from an Australian context, one of the outcomes of the disastrous fires in 2009 was a recognition that there is actually limits to what firefighters can do to suppress a fire. And in the Victorian Bushfire Royal Commission, the commissioners made the observation that, in fact, the most important role for the fire agencies was to warn the community. And to do that, you need the sort of approach that you've outlined, Matt, to make those predictions. I guess my other comment was to use those predictions to evacuate communities before a fire starts is a very bold move, and it would be interesting to see how that goes in the long term. Once again, oh yes, question.
I appreciate the work that you're doing, and I have a comment and a question. So I'm from Texas, but recently I was mobilized to the Gatlinburg area, the Pigeon Forge area, and I interviewed firefighters and lots of different people in incident command, and one thing that I heard over and over was that the South doesn't burn. Now, you said your motto can be used all over the world, but can it be used in the South? That's the, to interrupt the narrative that we don't burn like that. They were going to take down Ross. We weren't, people kind of dismissed the fire season in the South, and I'm wondering if your model could help interrupt that narrative.
So I will say that I was there in decision support in the South, so working in the geographic area, and we used it to brief all resources every day, and it absolutely hit everything spot on for them. It was the only thing that they found what actually worked. So yeah, the short answer is yes.
And we have one last question. Yes.
Sí, de la última pregunta. Quería saber cómo afrontan el tema de advertir a la comunidad de la peligrosidad de...
Un momento.
Bien, vale. El traductor.
here, we'll have to. Lo siento.
Hay que aprender más inglés. Vale, ok. Quería saber cómo afrontáis lo que es advertir a la población sobre el índice de peligro, si valoráis el que sea un arma de doble filo, como por ejemplo ha estado ocurriendo hasta hace bien poquito en Israel, que había un desmadre de incendios, y toda esa información se puede utilizar más que como prevención, como ataque.
So we've already had these conversations at home, trying to understand how we can use a resource like this to actually engage in the conversations with the communities, so that you build trust ahead of time before there's a fire, so that you have this conversation and basically create this shared exchange of information using a resource like this to engage in dialogue with the community in addition to engaging in dialogue with the firefighters. But it really has to happen in a pre-planning sense before there is a fire, because once there is a fire, people start to panic. So it's really important to start building trust and an understanding of these things early on, and to apply it as such to have that conversation. So.
Thank you very much, Matt, and could you join me in thanking Matt again for his presentation?